In an interview conducted 2 years before his death in 1968, Marcel Duchamp is found stating that he had used art to understand life and as a means to establishing a modus vivendi. In what follows, I focus on the Duchamp of three standard stoppages, of the possible and the infra-thin, to argue that the question of life is resolved here in and through an erotic attitude that privileges indeterminacy. Before I begin, however, and given Duchamp's reputation as daddy of postmodernism, it might be worth pointing out at the outset that the indeterminacy of which I speak is not semantic or epistemic, what would more properly be called uncertainty, but ontological, so that my Duchamp is actually a realist, though of the open kind. So I begin here with three standard stoppages. Duchamp's experiment with chance from 1913. In its permanent condition, or final stage, the work presents itself as an ensemble of elements. Three glass panels, each encasing a curved, 1-meter-long thread, are here accompanied by three wooden slats, each shaped along one side to match the curved trajectory of one of the three threads, and a box finally to contain all other elements. As an additional element of the work, we may, however, count the process that gives rise to it, and which Duchamp includes here in the form of notes, printed on the back of each canvas strip, and visible to observers thanks to the transparency of the material of the glass. A straight horizontal thread, 1 meter in length, the notations read, falls from a height of 1 meter. Three standard stoppages belonging to Marcel Duchamp. Now, where among all of these different elements is chance to be located in the work? Duchamp's notations invite us to repeat, if only by imagining, the movement that produces the stasis of the final product or stoppage, to contemplate the momentum of the fall. But things we know fall because of gravity, no chance. Thus, if we are to say that chance is somehow at work or play here in the fall, it cannot be the fall itself, but something added to it, the how of the fall perhaps. Duchamp's threads, however, cannot even be said to fall by chance, since we know that in actuality he instigates these movements by dropping, or rather releasing each thread from the height of 1 meter. The work is not accidental, random, or unpredictable in this way. Duchamp does not destine haphazardly, but do chance. To locate chance in the work, we must therefore turn to the only element in it which does remain surprising. Duchamp's three threads are, according to all descriptions of the work, dropped in the same way, and yet somehow they fall differently. Something, we're inclined to believe, intervenes in the fall, interrupting its movement and producing this difference. Chance in Duchamp, it can be argued, names this generator of difference. To speak of chance this way, however, need not make it mysterious. Duchamp's three threads are, I have said, dropped in the same way, but what was meant by that is only that they're dropped according to the same instructions. Of the conditions under which they're dropped, given that they are not those of a vacuum, one can in truth say only that they're similar. In the much longer essay from which this paper is drawn, I elaborate on this point through recourse to the writings of one of Duchamp's major scientific sources, the French mathematician and theoretical physicist Henri Poincaré. In order to be able to make predictions about the future, Poincaré everywhere repeats, the scientist must necessarily reduce indeterminism in both thought and action, why science happens inside, but he will never be able to get rid of it completely. The absurd fact, Poincaré knows, will never recur. The only thing that can be affirmed is that under analogous circumstances, an analogous fact would occur. In dynamical systems that display what is known as sensitive dependence to initial conditions, difference which may be imperceptible at first, a small breath of air, become, with the system's evolution in time, amplified, resulting in itineraries whose features, unlike those of Newtonian trajectories, are not written into their beginnings. Duchamp's three standard stoppages can be understood as an experiment that aims at showcasing this latter phenomenon, or at an exposition more generally the aesthetic means of the non-identity of analogous facts that underlies Poincaré's broader thesis of conventionalism. Still, Duchamp's three standard stoppages and conception more broadly of chance is, I hope to show, more ambitious than this. For in the last analysis, Poincaré thinks chance, indeterminacy, as a modality of necessity. Obedient to laws and fully compatible with determinism, chance is presented in his writings as a kind of cause, albeit of a complex nature. A very small cause or an assemblage, as Poincaré writes of causes, affecting inert objects from the outside. It is finally because, or rather only insofar as chance moves within limits set by laws that are themselves deterministic, that its effects can be captured in the language of probability, despite the fact that they cannot be predicted with precision. This, however, is not the chance that Duchamp presents us with. If the notations inscribed on the work state that the threads fall, a note dating from 1913 referring to the same experiment finds Duchamp writing that the threads fall, each of them distorting itself as it pleases. What this note invites us to think is arguably not a kind of hidden cause, itself the sum of imperceptible or complex causes, as chance was shown to be for Poincaré, but a truly spontaneous, that is to say, unnecessary movement, a free act. The difference, in other words, which the final series of stoppages exhibits in its variation, is with Duchamp not one to be attributed to something outside of itself, to a difference that is, in the initial conditions of the experiment, too small or too complex for us to be able to measure, but is here reconceived as a difference that makes itself, an effect without a cause, now internal, affected from within the heart of the material of its thread. To borrow from the thought of Gilles Deleuze, what we're invited to consider is not difference in repetition, which is here only secondary, but difference in and for itself, distorting itself as it pleases. Matter, the body, is jerked out of its inertia, and tasked with the responsibility of having to regulate its own form of movement, its own rhythm, which is now in turn singular, belonging to the individual, the particular alone. Matter, in other words, becomes idiorhythmos, the Greek word for the idiotic marching to the beat of her own drum, where it cannot be thought through conformity to norm or captured by a universal meter. What is at stake in affirming all this, it should by now be obvious, is the refutation precisely of the necessity, of causality as immutable law, that Poincaré chooses to hold on to in his own reflections on chance. The word law, Duchamp tells Calvin Tompkins in 1964, is against my principles, and causality is but a convenient form of making life possible. The three standard stoppages, no doubt, testifies to an anarchic tendency in Duchamp. The work, one may be tempted to conclude following this realization, deals not with science but with philosophy. Indeed, talk of a principle of absolute singularity, or of a difference that makes itself, as I previously described it, would seem to cohere only as a theory of the subject of consciousness, or a defense more precisely of a principle of free will or the will to power. The interpretation would not be without ground. Duchamp's construction of the three standard stoppages, we know, coincides with his discovery of the figure of Max Stirner, and his philosophy of radical individualism. I am my own, Stirner writes in The Ego and His Own, only when I am master of myself, instead of being mastered. Still, Duchamp would almost certainly not accept this reading, marked as it is by anthropocentrism or worse, idealism. The anarchist, it is well known, has little sympathy for the human, thinking itself a little god on earth. Now, what Duchamp seeks to free is not only mind, to which the human is too easily reduced, but also body and matter, the mind's generating cause. Still, the question immediately arises, how does matter, the body, gain the freedom to be individual? By virtue, quite simply, of having been always already not one, but multiple, plural. Indeed, isn't this that Duchamp demonstrates with the stoppages, and what he in fact had tried to show with the new descending staircase a year earlier? That when a body is in motion, it coincides not with itself, but with its own transition, its own variation. That it is never here or there at a certain point, but in the process always of appearing somewhere else, of trying to get away from itself, as Duchamp would have it. What this means is not that the body in motion is in between points or positions. No, the body does not coincide with its own variation in time. Duchamp's mistake in the nude was in catching the body in a freeze frame. It coincides with all of its non-actual variation all at once, with its own infinite potentiality. In motion, a body is in an immediate unfolding relation to its own non-present potential to vary. Matter, the body, is akin to a die with unlimited facets which must throw itself, but which in every throw is confronted with, feels its own indeterminacy, is openness to an elsewhere and an otherwise than it is, in any here and now, as Masumi writes. Every step of the movement must therefore involve not only a transition, but also a decision that can only be arbitrary, so that chance is not an event that being happens upon or which happens to being, but the event rather of being itself. Beginning and beginning again, the latter must at every moment make itself against the potentiality that is not present, yet absolutely real. Of it, but not it, real, material, but incorporeal, inseparable, coincident, but disjunct, and whose vastness presents being with the same infinite or at least indefinite number of possibilities that a blank sheet of paper presents the human imagination equipped with a pen. I feel 1,000 capacities spring up in me. I am March, gay, languid, melancholy by turns. I am rooted, but I flow, Virginia Woolf writes in The Waves. We call the activity that follows this encounter creativity. This, I think, is what Duchamp thinks about when he thinks about chance. Not only a principle of spontaneity, but novelty with genesis. And it is perhaps worth recalling at this point that Duchamp's note, which first introduced the difference I've been discussing in and for itself into my own thinking, is one to which he gives the title The Idea of the Fabrication. Duchamp's critics discover here a confession on his part pertaining to the falsehood surrounding the material production of 3 standard stoppages. I take the word to mean, in the original sense, a making, and understand the title to disclose the idea that what the work deals with is intervention, each thread participating in, or rather coinciding with its own determination in the process of falling, with its own transformation, giving rise to a determinate object formation only at the moment of arrest or stoppage. As defending such a principle of radical creativity, I read also Duchamp's notes on the possible, and which concerns the figuration of the possible, not as the opposite of impossible, nor as related to the probable, nor as subordinated to the likely. The link between this note and Duchamp's 3 standard stoppages is first established by Herbert Molderings. But what the historian does not stress enough, and which is crucial for me here, is just how radical a distance separates Duchamp's possible from habitual conceptions of the word. As Daniel Smith observes in an essay dedicated to Deleuze, we think of the possible as a field of possible options, only one of which can be realized by the real, with all other possibilities being thwarted and not passing into existence. 2 principles govern the relation. The real resembles the possible, and the real is a limitation of the possible. Duchamp's possible, by contrast, allows for the passing not only of the improbable or unlikely, but also of that which possibility, as a field of calculable, predetermined likelihoods, tells us cannot be. The impossible, the chance assigned a probability of 0. No longer the opposite of impossible, the Duchampian possible is therefore entirely incompatible with traditional understandings of the concept, wherein the possible, circumscribed, as Smith notes, by what is, anticipates the outcomes, both in form and number, of its own actualization. Here, nothing is delimited in advance, but the possible is only a physical caustic, vitriol type. Let me make this point clearer. What Duchamp's possible aims at communicating is not simply the thought that the unthinkable, in the sense here of some extreme event, can happen. What it entails, to put it differently, is not the thought that the impossible might turn out to have been possible all along. A much more radical idea is involved. The effort consists in figuring the possible independently altogether of the domain of possibility as a set of options or possible paths that are somehow given to being a priori, so that the very logic of existence that possibility implies is herein imploded. Closer to what Deleuze will, after Henri Bergson, come to call the virtual, the Duchampian possible intimates a pure potentiality, the actualization of which is akin to the event of miracle. A potential does not pre-exist its emergence. If it doesn't emerge, it is because it wasn't really there. If it does, it really only just arrived. Before coming, it will have been objectively indeterminate, really, not a calculable co-presence of already possibilities, Masumi writes. Thus, if in light of the note of the possible, Duchamp's 3 standard stoppages and conception of chance more broadly can be linked to something that is not, as Moldering writes, possibility, but an unnecessary being, or rather an event, located precisely outside the latter's bounds. The mark of what Elia Yash describes in her own time as absolute contingency. Real, absolute contingency, Yash writes in The Medium of Contingency, is improperly translated into possibility. Contingency strikes in place. It says at the stroke that a thing is what it actually is, and at the same time and in the same sense that it could have been different. Contingency, as Ayash puts it in a different instance, entails the thought that a thing can still be different, the word still taking here to mean the opposite of change and movement. Indeed, something not yet known in the time of Poincaré or of Duchamp's first experiments with chance forces us today to admit that, at a very fundamental level of reality, the contingency of existence is a fact. It is the lesson of what quantum mechanics calls vecteur d'onde in French, or wave function. What we learn from it, as Ayash explains, is that the notion of object and property and correlative of possible state, whose actualization would be the observation that the given object bears the given property, is only a derivative notion. What is absolute and not derivative, what precedes the stage of objectification, is a vector that is independent of the particular range of possibilities on which it will eventually be decomposed. It is the stroke of contingency. Ayash draws our attention to the impossibility, when dealing with the microscopic world, of leaving the phenomenon as we attempt to measure it. The impossibility, in other words, of gaining some perspective on it, or the distance necessary to be able to determine what is going on, what something is, what it's going to do, when no one is looking, what it's going to do next. The indeterminable is in fact here made to appear as a certain something only in the moment of measurement, with a collapse, crucially, of the wave function. Before that, it exists only in the state described by superposition. It has neither this or that property, nor both, nor neither. Werner Heisenberg, the German physicist who in 1927 would present the world with the uncertainty principle, was clear about this. Not only are we not able to measure the position and velocity of a quantum object simultaneously, the concepts have no strict meaning in nature. The classical path of a particle comes into being only because we observe it. This too is what Karen Barad aims at communicating, I think, when she argues that matter and meaning are entangled, and that measurements are discursive practices of mattering and world-making. Matter and meaning do not pre-exist, but rather are co-constituted via measurement interactions. Now I have to end this presentation, but I hope I have succeeded in transmitting enough material to allow you to follow me when, with Duchamp, I say that in thinking of life, we should feel free to disregard the results of the experiment in favor of the indeterminacy of experience, or of that infra-thin domain, as Duchamp calls it, where the I cannot be separated from the other in me. To disregard fixed forms of matter in favor of the poetic event through which the virtual becomes actualized in a multiplicity of things, languages, worlds. Thank you.